Okay, we should be streaming. Very good. Let me check this. Yes. Excellent. So, back for another video. This one was actually a request by my wife. Wanted to see me tackle the subject of what happens or how we end up in a situation where we have no electricity. We were talking about something, I can't remember what it was, and she said that's a good topic for a video. And this is 13th in a series called Massive Societal Change. And generally, excuse me, I'm a little choked up. Generally, what that series is about is what happens to society when global heating really sets in and starts to interfere with people's behaviors, their ability to do things, governance, economics, the whole kettle of fish. So we're going to tackle the subject of the electrical grid. And this is also somewhat informed by the fact that my brother works for the local, regional utility company, which serves up to homes and businesses both electricity and natural gas. He works on the electrical side, and he's a sort of an advanced troubleshooter. So he's often the first person to show up at an outage and has to stay around until everything has been resolved and troubleshooter. And the story I get from him is that the local grid here in the South Bay is actually really antiquated, heavily oversubscribed, in bad need of maintenance. It was, a lot of the electrical infrastructure was created since the 50s, but also a long time ago, right? The 50s, 60s, 70s, and hasn't really kept up. And of course, since then, since really the early 2000s, we've been adding a lot of data centers, cell towers, other ways of using electricity that create additional demand and represent additional failure points in many cases. So I thought I would tackle this. Now you can. Before I get too much further, I'm approaching 100 subscribers, which is a big deal for me for this little channel. So if you are not subscribed, do me a solid and go ahead, subscribe to the stream. There's going to be a lot more of these entries in this series of massive societal change. And even if you are subscribed, like the video, because that makes a difference to YouTube. So that's the bookkeeping out of the way. Now you can go on YouTube and you can find disaster scenarios, even movies, right, where the electric grid has failed and everyone's been plunged into the dark, and now they're surviving, and it's a big dramatic event, and of course looting the stores and the last of the bread and the eggs and the milk, and you can just imagine, right? It's a disaster movie, and you can, if you're doing Hollywood, you can cram a lot of disaster, a lot of interesting drama into a 90-minute movie about everyone running out of electrical power. And what are the dramas? The dramas are, depending on how long it lasts, it doesn't have to last very long. It doesn't have to last very long to become really dramatic. But some of the things that would happen to people when the power goes out for an extended period of time are the things that we see all the time in the news when the power goes out. People lose their refrigerated foods, in particular their frozen foods. People with medical equipment, that whatever's in their home that is keeping them alive. Well, they suddenly don't have electricity for their medical equipment, and they can start to suffer in a medical emergency. If you have a wired POTS line, Plano telephone service, if you have a wired POTS line, then your phone will probably work because the phone exchange provides its own power to the POTS lines. But most people don't anymore have a POTS line. So instead they have cell phone And of course, the cell phone towers, even if they have, some kind of a battery thing to keep them going, probably isn't very big, so it won't last for terribly long. But the cell phone towers will eventually go down. There have been concerns about that in the past when people find themselves in an emergency and their cell phone won't work to make an emergency call. Like, for example, the power failed and somebody has a medical emergency because some equipment failed in their home, and now they're calling the ambulance to come take them to the hospital, but it doesn't work because the cell phone towers have been shut down by the lack of power. So there's a lot of drama you could have here. And the longer the power outage continues, the more dramatic it gets. People suddenly start, I'm still talking Hollywood here, okay? People start looking for food, and people start, becoming distrustful of their neighbors, and shots are fired, and there's looting, and the police can't respond. Of course, no one can even make a phone call to get the police to come because, again, the phone network has gone down. So it's all very dramatic. Hospitals lose their lights, and so there's always somebody in surgery. This is Hollywood still. There's somebody in surgery or a woman is giving birth, and the lights go out, and all of a sudden, now the doctors and the surgeons are having to work by cell phone light or something like that. For a nice presentation of this, and I should add this to the description if I can find it. There's a documentary on YouTube by I can't remember his first name. Stephen Burke, Burke. He's a guy from I'll remember his name in a minute. He's a guy from the UK, and he did a series of stories that was all under the title of Connections, and they're all really interesting, and a lot of them are historic. But his episode 1 is actually the most intriguing, and what's intriguing about it is he goes back and reflects on the great U.S. Northeast blackout of whatever it was, 1960 something. My wife is in it because she's from New York. She remembers it. There was a great blackout, and it stopped the subways, and it stopped the traffic signals, and everyone's refrigerator stopped, and it's a long list, right? The whole Northeast of the U.S. was in a blackout. And it's interesting as to how that happened. It was a failure of some little tiny part. He actually has the part, or representative of the part. He's holding it in his hand. This part right here, he's holding it in his hand. Did something and brought down the entire Northeast United States distributed power grid. But he's not really interested in how it goes down. And whereas I'm going to be interested in that. What he is interested in is what happens to people. Now, in New York, of course, the power came back on. They figured it out. Wasn't easy, by the way. This is a whole study in complexity and brittleness and a bunch of other things. These electrical grids are monstrous machines, and when they go down, especially over a large area, it's really hard to bring them back up in a way that you don't fry the components. It is easy to destroy the grid just by trying to stand it back up if you don't do it right. It can take days. Hours at least, if not many days, to stand a very large grid back up. But his story about that is not that they stood it back up and everyone went about their business. He asked the question, well, what happens if it doesn't come back? And so now here you are. You're in New York City, or even the New England states, which is a highly populated area. And so what are you going to do? And I won't spoil it for you. And I don't really want to talk about it much right now. But it's a great it's a great documentary discussing what I'm just about to discuss here. Connections, episode 1. So that's Hollywood. That is not intended to be dramatic. He's asking the question, what would happen to you in the event that the electricity went down and did not come back in a timely fashion? Maybe it didn't come back for weeks or even months, or maybe didn't come back ever. And there are some interesting scenarios where the electricity goes away and doesn't come back ever. There are natural disasters that can cause the electrical grid to go down and not come back ever. I'll just mention those in passing because, again, you're going to run into those on YouTube, and they are interesting, but that's not my topic today. I'll just mention them to get them out of the way so we understand that that's not what I'm talking about. One of them is an EMP, electromagnetic pulse. EMPs are often, in the context of electrical grids, EMPs are often discussed as the result of a high altitude explosion of a nuclear weapon. Why would you do that? We discovered this on accident when we were doing atmospheric tests of nuclear weapons, and they didn't know, I don't think they knew, that this was even a thing, that you can explode a nuclear weapon in the atmosphere and it creates an electromagnetic pulse that radiates out from the blast site, and it can cover huge areas of the land. And the EMP is capable of interacting with transmission lines that are delivering electricity over long areas, and also electrical equipment that's on the ground, so substations and power conditioning equipment and things like that. That when the EMP happens and the electromagnetic pulse hits these wires, it induces currents in them and voltage spikes, and it can blow up the electrical infrastructure, just blow it up, or at least large parts of it. We discovered this back in the late 40s, early 50s, and after that, we kind of knew that was a thing, EMPs. There are actually, if I recall, there are even nuclear weapons that are designed specifically to be used to create an EMP. That's their job. They're designed to create a big enough EMP to knock out the electrical grid on a big enough area to be strategically useful in wartime. And of course, the advantage of using a weapon like that is you have little to, if any, ground level destruction of the infrastructure, and yet you can knock out the electricity for a wide area. I've even heard, I'd have to read a study on this, but I've heard, just in different sources, that one EMP detonated, one nuclear weapon formulated to create an EMP that is then detonated over the middle of the United States of America might be sufficient to knock out most of the grid scale utility in the country. And if one isn't enough, then two or maybe three certainly would. So this is a big deal. The EMP thing is a big deal, but in the context of something humans are doing. Humans are doing this. And so you can get an EMP that knocks out your grid. So I want to get that out there because you see a lot of that talk on YouTube. And it's very dramatic, very Hollywood, very interesting. And how do people survive without electricity? And yes, it's a topic. Another thing that can happen is more of a natural disaster. The sun in the sky, that bright thing in the sun, is the sun. The sun can, when it's having sunspot cycles, especially when sunspots are very abundant, it can generate what's called a coronal mass ejection, a CME. CMEs are charged particles that spew off of a sunspot, and it's a little bit like a death ray. It's particles that have been shot off the sun, and if they manage to hit the Earth, and the Earth is pretty small compared to a sunspot, so a sunspot is really huge, and if it throws off a big CME, and the Earth happens to be somewhere in the path of that, then hitting the Earth is actually really easy. So if there's a big CME, coronal mass ejection, that does hit the Earth, it can overcome the Earth's natural defenses, which is the magnetosphere, and basically act like an EMP. And this was experienced globally, but only in 1859, and that was called the Carrington Event, after the guy who was working with electricity at the time, and it happened to him, and I think he was also looking at the sun, so he was kind of caught in the middle of this thing. He was studying sunspots And then this thing happened, and it happened around him, and so he kind of was able to put the two together. And it's called the Carrington Event. Now, the Carrington Event is very special. Yes, it interfered with the electrical system as it then existed, which was really just the telegraph system. We didn't have a lot of electricity generation going around, and the telegraph system was run mostly on batteries. I think entirely on batteries. So there weren't big generators or things like that. The generator stuff came along with people like Tesla and Thomas Edison and stuff like that. But in 1859, we did have telegraphs. They were battery powered, and the Carrington Event happened in 1959, and it basically blew up the telegraph system. And again, these are just wires that run over long distances, and so when the EMP from the coronal mass ejection hit those wires, it induced heavy currents and heavy voltages and just basically fried the equipment up and down the line. Really interesting, definitely interesting topic to look at. And of course, there's a lot of speculation of what would happen today, not 1859, of course. Now it's 2025, and what would happen if there was a similar event like the Carrington Event. Now, the Carrington Event was really peculiar, and it's not going to be easy to repeat that. The things that happened was a very specific alignment of solar activity. For example, it was two CMEs, one right behind the other, which I don't think I've ever heard of that happening since then. We still get CMEs. There's different classifications. People still get all worked up about them. But the Carrington Event itself was pretty special. It was two, one right behind the other. And basically, the first one acted like a battering ram and distorted the magnetosphere. And then the second one came through and just sort of slipped in. Just slipped past the natural defenses because they were brought down by the first CME. So the Carrington Event is not likely to happen real soon. We still get high value, high index CMEs, and people get all worked up about it, and then really nothing happens. Nothing interesting. So, but that is a thing, and you can find videos on that on YouTube. I just want to mention that because that's not really what I'm talking about here. I'll also mention, because it's maybe a little more likely, hackers. The modern electrical system is operated mostly by what we call SCADA, system control and data something. You look it up. It's an acronym, SCADA, SCADA. SCADA systems are really common in industry, and SCADA systems are also used to manage the electrical grid. So you can control switches, you can control generators, you can control all kinds of things remotely using a SCADA system. Well, SCADA systems are network systems. So if you're a hacker and you can find your way into a server or a part of the system, and then you maybe have executive control, right? It's possible. Or you could have a bad actor, right? A terrorist happens to be working in the utility office, and they have access to the SCADA systems, and if they're a bad actor, they could use their authority, use their access to just bring the system down or make the system blow itself up. Again, there's protections against all this kind of stuff. It's somewhat hypothetical, hasn't happened yet, could happen. Maybe we get some hacker terrorism that knocks down the electrical grid. There's concerns that the Chinese have already infiltrated our SCADA systems for our grid, and the North Koreans and the Russians, and so I guess we'll see. I guess we'll find out if that's true or not. So, to the topic today. I want to get all that out of the way just to demonstrate that I know what all that is. And that's all interesting, and it's worth studying and worth becoming familiar with. That's not what I'm talking about today. I am talking about the grid system going down because of a collapse of civilization, which sounds like it would be the same, but it's not. You can probably recover from a CME. If you had a CME and it blew up a certain amount of equipment, the utility workers could probably repair it and get the system back up. Hacking maybe is a little bit harder, but if you could eject the hackers from your system, you could stand the system back up. An EMP, meaning we're basically having a nuclear exchange, might be harder. There might be enough equipment destroyed by the electromagnetic pulse from a nuclear weapon, a high altitude nuclear weapon, that you might have major system problems. But I don't know that any of these would represent permanent damage. Any one of those. Now I've only mentioned 3, and there's I'm sure a half a dozen more I haven't even thought about. I'm just kind of riffing here, okay? It's entirely likely that you could get all that stuff repaired and back up and running, especially in the case of a hacker attack, because they're not really destroying things necessarily, although they could, so much as they're just taking control and shutting it down or making it do weird things. You could get control back, and you might be able to stand that grid back up in 2 or 3 days, a week, a month. Now, that would still be devastating, especially a month. There would be a lot of people that couldn't survive that. And if it happens in the summer, during the heat, when the air conditioning is running, or if it happens in the winter when it's really cold and people maybe are heating their house with electricity, probably not too much of that going on, but maybe there's some people are, then, people are going to suffer and some people might die. It's unlikely, but so long as they have family or somebody in the community can rescue them and take them in or whatever, then maybe they'll be okay. But it could be harmful on the tune of weeks, if not months, to get the system back up. But you probably could get the system back up. Now I'm going to talk about a scenario where it never comes back. And we become powerless. Forever. Powerless forever. For all time. So I wrote a book. It was 100 Days, and the link is in the description, where I go into this a little bit. The sort of disaster that takes the electric grid down and it never comes back won't even seem like a disaster. I discuss it in the book, and I go into how people react to that, respond to that, because it is part of the collapse of civilization that we become powerless. And how that affects people and how they react to that is really interesting and important to analyze. James Burke, I think that's his name, James Burke, I just remembered, was talking about that in his first episode of the series called Connections. He was talking about that. It doesn't come back. And he didn't bother coming up with a realistic, scientific, non-fictional scenario where that could happen. He just says, look, pretend that it never comes back. How are you going to live? And the series, episode 1 of the series called Connections is really, really riveting. It's very enlightening. You should watch that. Go watch James Burke, episode 1 of Connections. And watch the rest of it too, because it's all really interesting how we got here. Connections is all about something that I mention on this channel occasionally, and I probably will have to mention it again at some point in this video, which is path dependency. See, the electrical grid didn't always exist. It was built. And there are still old parts, and then there are newer parts bolted on, and then the SCADA systems was bolted on, and then there's servers, and there's all these remote connections and cell towers, and all this stuff is bolted on to the electrical grid. But how that was built is path dependent. And if it ever went down in a big way, the question would be, can we repeat that process at all? And that is a huge question. It took 100 years to build the grid. It took 100 years of layering on and training people and best practices in electrical engineering, even mechanical engineering, right? And so, but all that building that happened, all that construction that happened over 100 years, if it does go down, are you going to be able to bring it back up? Because you might not. So how does this happen? I have been looking at how global heating can bring down civilization, what it looks like as that happens, what people would see during that time, and what we would be forced to deal with towards the end of that process. So the electrical grid powers everything, essentially. We do have natural gas, and then we have fuels for our vehicles, trucks, trains, whatever. But the control of all these things, like street lights and control lights to control traffic, or electricity to charge your electric vehicle, and of course electricity to run elevators, escalators, automatic doors like you have at the store that open when you walk up to them. It's ubiquitous, it's invisible, it's everywhere, and depending on how it goes down, we may be just we could get wiped out. We could get wiped out, and it wouldn't take very long for that to happen because we are so dependent on it. Now, we are dependent in general on energy, coal, crude oil, and natural gas. 20% of our fossil fuel consumption, coal, crude oil, and natural gas, 20% of that, 20% of our energy mix, I said it wrong, 20% of the energy we use is electricity, 20%. The rest of it is fossil fuels. And the rest of it is for things that cannot be adequately electrified. Maybe in the future, maybe after a bunch of research, maybe after some miracles take place, but we can't really electrify long-haul freight, air cargo, the airline industry, cargo ships, trains of just about any kind. We have a light rail here in our community, so they're a little bit ahead of the game, but there's a lot of other things that still run on liquid fuels. And of course, all the lighting. We get our lighting from electricity. We used to get lighting from what they call town gas, or I don't know, maybe you could do it with natural gas. I'm not really sure, but but that 20% is still a very important part of how we do things, how we get along, how we get around. But most of our energy mix is still fossil fuels. So losing electricity is like, okay, it's only 20% of the mix. But to some extent, it is the most important part of the mix because it's the technology, it's the medical systems, it's the hospitals, it's water treatment and delivery, it's sewer treatment, it's all the pumping that happens. And on the subject of pumping, your service station, where you get your gasoline or diesel for your vehicle, the pumps are electric. That didn't used to be the case. Used to be that pumps, there was a big tank and it was full of fluid, and you took the spout and it used gravity to fill your tank. Well, that's not the case. All these tanks are now underground, and there's electrical pumps and other systems that pump it. So if you lose electricity, even though your car doesn't really run on electricity, unless it's an electric car, it runs on liquid fuels. You can't get those liquid fuels out of the ground easily without electricity. So there's all these tie-ins of all these things that we do that are dependent heavily on electricity. Now, in the case of global heating, which is now upon us, we're headed into it. We have to start having an adult discussion about what this is going to do to us. Global heating will bring down the electrical grid. It will destroy it. It will make it unstable, and or it will destroy the equipment, and or it will not prove adequate to demand and leave people basically cut off of the grid for long periods of time, if not forever. So how does that happen? The electrical grid is not only built at great expense and using a lot of fossil fuels to do it. Trucks, heavy equipment, manufacturing, everything has to be built. Some of the switches come from Germany, France, the UK, and they have to be built over there and then shipped over here. There's companies in Germany that just make the enormous transformers that are used in substations and underground stations in urban areas, and those have to be transported from wherever they're made. So there's an enormous amount of investment, including using energy apart from electricity, like crude oil, gasoline, to build it in the first place. And then there's a huge army of people. Like I said, my brother is one of these people. There's a huge army of people whose responsibility is to keep it working. And again, they have big trucks, and they have bucket trucks, and they have all these dispatches, the people on the radio all the time. Cell phone now, I guess, these days, cell phones, but it used to be the radio, right? And they're being dispatched over here, and someone calls on the phone. Again, maybe it's a landline, but maybe it's a cell phone. They call and say, our block has no electricity, and then the dispatcher, talks to the drivers out in the field and gets them to go over there and troubleshoot that. And this goes on 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's an enormous number of people who are involved in this, and there's an enormous amount of equipment, some of which is getting really old and is subject to breakdown. And so long as we're able to keep up with everything, every line that drops, every pole that's knocked over by a person in a car, every time a piece of equipment just breaks, just an insulator just breaks off, it falls off. That happened right in front of my house over here. Man, that was dramatic. That was a high voltage line, I had like 12,000 volts or something, and that sucker came down, and it was like the end of the world out there. You should have seen it. You hear it too. And so when this equipment breaks or it comes down, it causes a lot of damage. Oh man, it shot electricity through the building on the same side of the street, because I guess it hit the building and then it shot electricity through to the ground and it broke all this concrete off. These can be very dramatic failure modes. We've had not recently, but when we moved into this house, there was a series of transformer explosions. The transformers are the big cans that sit up on the power poles, and they reduce the electricity from like 12,000 volts down to household current. They get hot, especially with heavy load. They get hot, and they're filled with oil. The oil is supposed to act like an insulator to keep the thing from arcing internally, but sometimes the oil becomes contaminated or it gets cooked too much and from the heat, from the excessive use, and then the oil doesn't work as an insulator, and then the thing shorts itself out internally. 12,000 volts is not something you want to mess with. So it shorts itself out internally and blows up like a bomb. You can hear it for half a mile. We had several of those in our neighborhood. Of course, when it blows up, it takes down the power for a certain part of the neighborhood. Well, a person has to come out. There's a big bucket truck. When this thing blew up across the street, we had like 3 trucks out there pretty much all night trying to fix that thing. And they couldn't even get on the pole until they had troubleshot the entire line up and down the street. And finally they got up there, and it took them forever to fix it. We got to watch them. And during that time, several blocks on either side of us and all the way down to the next main street was completely powerless because it took down the whole system. Now, imagine if those people didn't show up. Why would they not show up? Because there's something else happening in the world. And this is where global heating comes in. Let's say that, and I say, let's say, this is speculation, but it's not science fiction. This is just speculation. It will happen this way for lots of people. I don't know if it's going to happen with me. I don't know if it's going to happen with you. But this is just speculation based on contingent facts of history. Let's say that the world is having problems with the global economy. And it's becoming difficult to ship things from one continent to another. It's difficult to manufacture things. Why would it be? Because global heating has made it too hot to live and work in some areas, that there are power outages associated with equipment failure. And then the power outages make it difficult or impossible to manufacture the replacement parts for the grid. So this is like an aggravation now. Power outages and brownouts make it difficult to manufacture the parts that you're going to need to repair the grid when it goes down. And so all this stuff starts to pile on top of itself. in my book, I can't remember when the power failed. It was like 2 weeks in, maybe 3 weeks in, that everything, it's clear to the characters in the book that the wheels are coming off. Nothing is working. The police stop coming when you call 911. You can call 911. You can get your cell phone on and you can call somebody, but either the call doesn't go through, it's too busy, or if you call them and they say, yeah, we'll send somebody, they never send anybody because the wheels are falling off of civilization. And what's that look like? You can have a number of things that can happen because of global heating and related problems that start to shut down civilization bit by bit. Food chain breakdown. It gets too hot to manufacture, to grow, harvest, manufacture, ship, and store complicated foods. Any failure in that chain of complexity to get food to us means the stores end up being empty. And when the stores are empty, what do people do? They panic. And then they're looting the stores, and they're looting all the stores. If it's just a big box shop that suddenly can't get enough stuff to stock their shelves, but the local family market is doing fine because they're on a different distribution network. See, they may have a different distributor who still has a supply chain, but the big box stores or the big supermarkets don't. Maybe their supply chain fails sooner. So then what do? They go to the family market, and rather than going in there with their credit card and their cash to swipe their stuff, and walk out having paid for it, they just loot the shop. And then suddenly there's not only no food in that shop, the family store on the corner, or the liquor store on the corner, or the whatever else it is, the Dollar General on the corner. Not only is there no food in there, the store itself is gone. The store is finished. And so there's not going to be a truck that pulls up at the back at 2 o'clock in the morning and unloads a bunch of boxes of food and beverages into this store so that you come back tomorrow and the shelves are restocked. It's not going to happen. The store has been destroyed. So there's a lot of things that can happen that cause people to panic. Panic is the basis of civilizational collapse. Period. Everything that collapses because people panic. And people always panic. There's never a time when they don't do that. Someone who doesn't panic will be completely mystified by what they're seeing around them because it's all panic. And people fight over food, they fight over gasoline, they come out with their weapons, waving their weapons around, they're having a heart attack, an anxiety attack, and they're waving their weapons around. Then people panic even more. Then shots are fired and, get off my lawn, and bang, bang, and people are panicking, right? And the whole thing just collapses under the panic. Nobody can step back and say, okay, hold on, folks, let's work this out. We can share, we can take turns, whatever. And let's not destroy civilization. But they can't have that conversation, so they destroy civilization. That's what happens in the book. A couple of things start to get sketchy. A couple of things kind of stop working the way people expect. There's a very small nuclear exchange between North Korea and South Korea or something like that. Doesn't even really affect anybody. It's just in the news. And that's World War III, one and done. But people panic. They panic. And they steal everything that's not nailed down. They break into all the shops, everything. Of course, they steal 70-inch TVs and expensive clothing and watches. They steal everything, but there's no food. And then there's no electricity. The very next shoe to drop is there's no power. Why is that? Because, again, remember, there's an army. There's 10,000 men and women that have to keep the electrical grid working. And that's just like where I live. You got that many more on the East Coast. You got that many more in the Southeast. You've got thousands and thousands of people who have to be really comfortable, very comfortable, to go out in public, work around panicking people, get shot at, and not worry about their own family. That's the requirement. That you're okay being out in the collapse of civilization by yourself largely, and you've got your truck. Oh, of course, everyone wants your truck Because what? Your truck has a great big fuel tank, and they want the fuel, and they're panicking, and they're stealing everything that's not nailed down. And so you're supposed to go out now because there's been a power failure, because someone panicked, and they drove their car into a power pole, knocked the power pole over. 1,200 households, 1,200 customers are now without power. So you go out there in your truck, and you're looking at that, and you say, wow, that's dumb. Who did this? Meanwhile, all around the region, other people are panicking, driving like maniacs, hitting power poles, as you do, and knocking them down. And pretty soon you've got 50 power poles been knocked down in random locations all around the area. And you're going to ask your army of technicians to go out into this chaos, and you're expecting them to troubleshoot the power pole, figure out how to engineer a new power pole, get the crew out there with the new pole, and another piece of equipment to dig a hole and put the pole in the ground and climb the pole and put on the wires and get it all fixed. And you expect them to do that while all around them is looting and arson and gunfire and everything else, and they're not going to do it. Ta-da! There you go. They're not going to do it. And they'll make that decision all at once, within like 3 hours. Someone's going to say, they're in the break room, and or they're on the radio, and they're talking among themselves. Radio or cell phone or whatever. They're talking among them. They're in a chat room. Chat. They're in a company chat room, and they're talking about the situation. And some guy who just went out to check on a power pole that got knocked over by a maniac in a car, he comes back and he says, man, I got shot at. I'm not dealing with this problem. That pole is down. It's going to stay down as far as I'm concerned. And so he goes back to the yard. And then all the time he's going back to the yard, he's thinking, where's my family? Where's my spouse? Where's my children? And of course, that person is now on the phone calling the spouse or calling the adult children saying, hey, get home. You have to get home right now. I'm out here in the field. I'm getting called on to fix these downed power poles because maniacs in cars. And this is a war zone. What do you mean it's a war zone? Well, gunfire and looting, and there's smoke all over the place. And when I came to look at this pole, and then people start shooting at me, and so I'm out. Fuck it, I'm out. And everybody get home, and we're going to evaluate what we're going to do. But I'm not going out in this truck to fix these poles that these maniacs are knocking over with their car, speeding around the countryside. And so you've got 50 power poles down. I know this is speculation, but it's not. It's not fantasy fiction. This is how people are. And I'm right. And this is how it goes down. Once things start to fall apart in a big enough way for it to feel regional, it feels big. And you're not going to get any help. It's big enough. You don't think that other group of people working in that other county are going to come help you. They've got their own problems. Their markets have no food. Their people are rioting. Their people are shooting guns up in the air. Their maniacs are knocking down the power poles, speeding down the street in the city. And so they're not going to come help you. And you're sitting there thinking about your family and your offspring and what you're going to do as you're watching this come completely off the rails. So it goes unfixed. Now, this is not a CME, and this is not a Carrington event, and this is not an EMP, and this is not Hollywood anymore, is it? This is just human nature. This is just how people are. And it's not going to go down all at once like an alien invasion or like an EMP or a nuclear attack or whatever. It's going to go down in pieces here and there, eventually everywhere. And this army of people who are also looking for food at the supermarket, who are also trying to get their families together in a safe place, who are also thinking about fleeing the area to go where, who knows, but that's their thought. That's their thought process. I'm going to leave. And so that's it. You're done. And it doesn't take very long. It takes some time, but not a lot of time, for the system to just gradually unwind. And 100 years of building and attaching and scaling and technological updates and maintenance and best practices, 100 years of that can come to nothing. in the matter of a few days or a week, as people just give up. They give up. And you can have wind turbines, and you can have solar arrays, and you can have a nuclear power plant. Oh, nuclear is a whole nother question. Just, okay, we'll do that. Hydro power. You can have all these things going, but because the far end of this, the consumer end of this, just goes to pieces, these generators have to shut down. They can't continue to push electricity onto the grid if there are big areas that are just going dark. And when a car hits a power pole, again, I've seen this right here in front of my house. It wasn't a car in this case, it was a mechanical failure of the pole. But doesn't matter, it's the same outcome. We've had cars hit power poles in our neighborhood. There were like 2 in 1 month for some reason. When the pole goes down, or the wire goes down, or the insulator breaks, or the transformer on the pole blows up, it takes down entire areas. Whatever that 12,000 volt line was servicing, it could be 2 or 3 blocks. It might be 1,200, 1,500 customers. And if that's happening in a lot of places, then what happens is that the army of maintenance workers who are supposed to fix these things, they give up and they flee. They refuse to go to work, and then any other thing that happens becomes permanent. And as the system drops offline, and as neighborhoods go dark, one after the other, eventually even the power sources have to shut down. And this is the deep, dark secret here. They can't push electricity onto a grid that has fewer customers. They have to start shutting down, or they'll actually burn up the equipment. If they keep pushing electricity, then you start getting essentially voltage drift. And what's supposed to be 120 volts here in the U.S., it's 120 volts split phase to housing. What's supposed to be 120 volts split phase to your house becomes 140, or 160, or 260 split phase. So now your appliances, your charger for your car, all these things are way over voltage because they didn't shut down the source. It just kept pushing electrons onto a system that's gradually going dark over random but wide areas. And so they have to cut back. They have to cut back on provisioning. And at some point, they may have to shut the system down completely. Just take it offline. And of course, when you do that, then the whole system drops down. It just drops off. Even if your neighborhood still has transmission lines and still has transformers and still has good electricity to your residence or your business, because the source had to take evasive action to preserve themselves and the rest of the grid from overvoltage and overamperage, because they had to take evasive action, then they go dark. And when that happens, you're finished. Now, it might take a week before things get so bad that the generator sources have to go dark. At the same time that the consumption end is going dark because of just we can't do the maintenance anymore, the people who are running the generation sources, I'm calling them generator sources. So what are these? I just mentioned them. Solar arrays, wind farms, hydropower plants, nuclear power plants, natural gas-fired power plants with boilers. As these sources are finding themselves pushing into a grid that's going dark, the people at the power plant, I just named a bunch of different kinds of power plants, the people at the power plant are also having trouble at home. And as the power plant is gradually ratcheting down because the demand for power is going offline, power poles being knocked over, whatever else, as the demand starts to drop with the end of civilization, which is because of the rioting and the panic, right? These are all the dots that connect. As the demand starts to drop, the power plant starts to shut down. Eventually, the people who operate the power plant are going to see the handwriting on the wall, and their families are panicking. Their children are home. Their spouses are in a panic. Businesses are shutting down. Stores don't have food. Stores have been looted and set on fire. They're never going to have food. It's going to take months to repair the damage. And at the same time all that's happening, these people who are operating the power plants are thinking, okay, there's no need for me to be here. And they split. They go home. And they stay home. And even going to work, you can just imagine, they're going to work and they're on the freeway, and the freeway is just full of people who are just blind with panic. They're weaving in and out of cars, shooting at each other, road rage, get out of my way, I have to get to an emergency. And, the cars in the ditches, cars full of bullet holes, cars on fire, and they have to drive through this to get to the power plant to make the thing work for the benefit of everybody who needs power, which is fewer people all the time, but still somebody. And they give up. They just give up. They stop coming. And if there's a manager at the power station who's, toughing it out, gung-ho to try and do the right thing, pretty soon he or she might be the only person who comes to work. And you can't run a power plant with one person, no matter how gung-ho they are. So it's one of those things, right? Last one out, turn off the lights. Last one out, turn off the lights. And so they bring it down. Now, I mentioned nuclear power. And I don't want to cap on nuclear power here, but I'm going to say something that ties into this idea that power can go down and stay down forever. And the way it does that is not what you think. Not a meteorite, it's not Godzilla, it's very subtle. Nuclear power plants have to be shut down cold. It's a difficult process. A cold shutdown of a nuclear power plant. There are some things you can do quickly, like inject all the control rods to shut down the nuclear reactions. But the nuclear pile will remain hot for weeks after that. So you have to be there. There has to be a crew to circulate the water through the pile and cool the pile. And what you're trying to avoid is meltdown, destruction of the nuclear plant through thermal runaway, hydrogen venting, and a bunch of other stuff. So there has to be a crew there. It has to be there every day to monitor the cold shutdown. And that can take 2 or 3 days. Has to monitor the cold shutdown. Then they have to be there to monitor the shutdown plant, that nothing bad happens. And if nothing else, they're providing security. They don't want anybody coming in there and fiddling with the blinking lights, okay? So, well, those people, they leave. I mean, maybe they try to do something. They try to do a proper shutdown. But at some point, do they really want to sit there and watch this power plant go cold, which might take weeks? Their families are in a crisis. Their neighbors have fled. The freeways are full of cars heading every possible direction because there's no food. Now there's no electricity. And so these power plant operators will just disappear. They'll shut the thing down, do their best that they can, best effort. And then they're going to say, I hope someone can stay here and monitor this thing, but I've got a spouse and 3 kids, and they're in a blind panic, and they're calling me on the phone every 10 minutes when you're coming home. Sorry, guys, I'm out. And they go home, and they never come back. So you've got a nuclear power plant. I know this sounds like I'm capping on nuclear power. I'm just trying to make a different kind of point. These things get shut down during a crisis, during a global crisis. If the crisis is such that people panic over a wide area about a lot of things, then the infrastructure could actually implode in a way that does not allow it to be recovered later. A nuclear power plant that isn't properly cooled and properly maintained could actually catastrophically fail. And maybe it's not, Chernobyl, radioactive smoke and all that, although it could be. Someday it could be. But maybe it just suffers internal damage because it cooled down too fast, or it didn't cool down enough, or there was some way for the radioactive elements to continue reactions, and so there's a hot spot, and the hot spot catches fire, and then the fire goes unattended because there's nobody there, and that's not how it's supposed to be. There's supposed to be somebody there on site the whole entire time, and so the power plant could just be blown up. I don't mean blown up like a nuclear Hiroshima. I mean it could just internally just destroy itself. And if there are fuel rods sitting in cooling ponds, and the cooling ponds have water circulating over them to keep them cool, and whatever happens, the pumps don't work anymore because there's no electricity. I mean, the nuclear power plant is not run on the electricity that it generates. It's run on the electricity from outside, from the grid, just like your house runs or any other business. It's on the grid and gets electricity from the grid. They actually have to have backup generators. Even though there's a nuclear power plant that's generating electricity, they have to have backup generators. Think back to the Fukushima disaster with the Japanese nuclear power plants. Their generators didn't work because the tsunami came in and it flooded the generator gallery, and then it knocked down the grid power. So they didn't have grid, they didn't have generators, they did have batteries, but the batteries ran down in a couple of hours. Then they had no control over the valves and the control rods and everything else. They had no control over the cooling ponds for the used fuel rods. And it just went to shit. Now, the rest of Japan was working fine. So they could flood into Fukushima and help with the reactors. But if there had been a wide, region-wide, or even global collapse of all these support networks, all these other people who could come rushing to your aid in the case of a disaster, if there's a regional collapse and everyone is now running around, panicking, of course, trying to figure out their own lives, well then, no one shows up. It worked for the Japanese during the the disaster in Fukushima. That worked, but in a different scenario of a global collapse, it wouldn't work. So the point I'm trying to make is that a small enough disaster, even like a Carrington event, a small enough disaster could knock you down for days or weeks or maybe even a month. But there would be external forms of support that would come and support you to help you get back on your feet. But in the case of a large scale, global scale running disaster, which might take months to even play itself out, there's not going to be anybody. And then you're powerless. And because it took 100 years to build this system in the first place, once you're powerless, there's not going to be this army of technicians and all this money and all this everything else to come back and stand it all back up. It's not going to happen. And there you go. It could be down for all time. And you are powerless. So it's worse than you think. It's worse than Hollywood portrays. It is far more likely than any of the things you might think, like an EMP or a CME or a hacker attack. Those might happen, but what I've just described is almost certainly going to happen at some point because of global heating. And what are we going to do? I'm kind of done here for now, so I can discuss ways that people could get by without all that, but I'm not going to do it now. I just wanted to talk about being powerless, what that looks like, how that happens, and then we'll have a second video on how to get around that.